You're listening to Decolonization, a podcast series that explores how Ukraine and Eastern Europe are perceived globally and why countering Russian imperial influence is crucial for the future of global democracy. The podcast is created by Ukrainian International, and I'm your host, Anastasia Marushevska. The guest of today's episode of Decolonization series is Daria Mattingly. She's an affiliated lecturer at the University of Cambridge and a lecturer in European history at the University of Chichester. Dr. Mattingly is an expert on the social and cultural history of the Soviet Union, with a particular focus on Ukraine and the 1932-1933 Holodomor genocide. She has contributed to Anne Applebaum's Red Famine and is currently working on the identifiable and memorial traces of the Holodomor perpetrators. This episode was recorded with the informational support of the Ukrainian Institute London, an independent charity that champions Ukrainian culture and shapes the conversation about Ukraine in the UK, and also with the support of the National Museum of the Holodomor Genocide, a Ukrainian state museum that preserves the memory of the Holodomor victims and highlights the history of the genocide of the Ukrainian nation.
Thank you for having me, and I'm very, very pleased to be here today.
What was the Holodomor in the narrowest sense? How would you explain it to someone who've never heard of it or don't understand the details?
This is exactly what I face pretty much in my work, because people in the West, even in academia in Britain, very rarely hear about Ukrainian history prior to the invasion of 2022 or annexation of Crimea. So when I'm talking about my research or when I refer to the Holodomor, I have to explain to somebody who's never heard about the Holodomor. And what I say is that in the narrowest sense, it is 1932-33 famine in Ukraine. And to give them some reference, I mentioned collectivization. There was a famine in the Soviet Union that followed collectivization. But in Ukraine in 1932-33, there was a famine within a famine. It was a man-made famine. In the wider sense, in overarching definition of the Holodomor, I say that it was not just the famine, man-made famine, but it was also concurrent persecution of Ukrainian political elite, intelligentsia, Ukrainian church, and then I could expand and explain some complexities of the phenomenon. But yes, in the narrowest sense, we always mean that it is 1932-33 famine.
Can you explain why it was a man-made famine and how did the Soviet government manage to engineer it on this scale?
Oh, absolutely. And I have to always add that how it was possible, because people ask me, how can you do it in 20th century in Europe, famine and man-made? Does it mean you take away all the food? And I say that is exactly that. And collectivization made it possible for the mechanism of the Holodomor to happen. So first, you introduce collective farms where all Ukrainian peasants, and not Ukrainian, all Soviet peasant citizens in the countryside had to work. So you make sure that all the food they produce is accounted, and it is centrally procured by the states, and nothing is left behind. And what is left behind from their vegetable plots, their pickles, their foodstuffs, other foodstuffs, is taken away from those plenipotentiaries sent from the district centers, from oblast. So centrally, it was all centrally managed. So of course it starts with somebody at the top issuing an order, and which is disseminated all the way to the back, to the bottom. And on the ground, you have district officials, village officials, such as the head of the village council or the head of the collective farm, that oversee enforcement of these orders. And the orders were to procure everything that was produced, because the quotas for 1932-33 grain procurement by the state were unrealistic for Ukraine in particular. And they were lowered about 3 times, never met. And so it was a conscience, there was intentional there was an intention to remove all food from the countryside. And so these brigades go from house to house and take away all food and valuables that could be exchanged for food. There are also provisions for people not to obtain food anywhere else, in the fields, in the when it's stored or when it's transported. So you have different legislative acts punishing people who would go to the fields, try to cut some ears of wheat and so on. So we have a very meticulously planned man-made famine. So there was already famine provoked by collectivization, because collectivization destroys the agriculture. It removes any motivation to work hard because you're not paid money. You're effectively a serf. So when you enact such policies from all the way from the top to the bottom, when you remove food, there is reasonable conclusion to assume that the politicians want population to starve, their own population to starve. Nobody can survive without food, and it's foolish to assume there was no intent, if you remove food, not to starve somebody to death, or to the degree when you teach, and we know that from correspondence of the top leadership of the Soviet Union, to teach somebody a lesson. So yes, that would be how it was engineered.
And also, what is, I think, discussed inside Ukraine, but I rarely hear these from the outside somehow, from the outside experts, about the blackboards and about that Ukrainians were actually banned from leaving their villages. So they were kind of trapped inside, so they cannot go out, cannot travel to other cities to look for food or even to exchange something for food. Maybe can you also tell about this wider system around that supported this famine, man-made famine?
And that is exactly those measures you mentioned. They're tied to the fact that how Ukrainian famine was different from that of in the rest of the Soviet Union, all Soviet famine. How Ukrainians were targeted as compared to other regions of the Soviet Union. So when I say there are legislative acts to prevent people obtaining food elsewhere, so just imagine, all food is taken away from you, you live in a small village, what would you do? And you can't go to the fields to get food, because there is a law of from 7th of August 1932, which is called more commonly known as the law of 5 years of grain, or 5 cycles of grain. You can't go to the fields. Everything is taken away from you. You would naturally want to leave your village and seek food somewhere else, or take your take your family with you, but ultimately first you want to live to see if you can obtain food elsewhere. So from January 1933, there was a decree prohibiting Ukrainians leaving the borders of Ukrainian Soviet Republic. So you couldn't cross into Russian Federation, you couldn't cross into Belarus. Obviously, you couldn't go abroad, even though many tried and were crossing the border into Romania and into Poland. Some unsuccessfully, most unsuccessfully, but some did manage to survive. So you try to go to Russian Federation or Belarus, but from January you can't do that. And no such measures were applied to other parts of the Soviet Union, apart from the lower Volga region, but in February 1933, where ethnic Germans were living in an autonomous republic. So we see certain groups within Soviet Union targeted. So if you're prevented from leaving Ukraine, it doesn't mean people didn't try. And within 4 weeks after that decree prohibiting Ukrainians leaving the republic, we have over 200,000 Ukrainians detained, and some of them went through filtration camps. They were called filtration camps as such at the time, to be returned back to the republic. So we see the authorities controlling the movement of people. So you're preventing them from eating, you're preventing them from moving, and there is some policy to make them, to starve them. And about blackboards. So there was a practice, a policy, which was applied in Ukraine extensively and earlier than anywhere else, of punishing collective farms and the whole districts, villages, for not meeting their grain procurement quota. So when I repeatedly use this term grain procurement quota, it's pretty much a target set for your collective farm or your district by the state, how much grain you should submit to the state. And you're not paid money for that. You just have to submit it in some kind of tax, which later, after the famine, it was turned into a tax rather than a target for you to meet. And so if you're not meeting the target, you would be punished. And there were so-called black boards. Obviously, there were no physical black boards where the name of your collective farm would be put for punishment. What it meant that district newspapers would announce that such and such village have not met their target, and therefore they are on the black board, which meant, in physical terms, it would be that all provisions from that village, including from storage, from the village shop, all provisions such as are used to cook food, for cooking food, including matches, kerosene, salt, everything, would be removed from the village. You would be prohibited from leaving the village, even to go into the city. And sometimes they would be rounded up, these villages, and sometimes the army, the soldiers would be involved in surrounding that village to prevent people from leaving. But ultimately, it would create conditions incompatible with life. So you were supposed to meet the target, and then you would be allowed to cook food. So that is definitely faminogenic policies applied. And they were applied to Ukraine from November 1932. So considerably earlier than anywhere else in other targeted parts of the USSR.
And what did the USSR do with the food they took from Ukrainians?
That's a good question, actually, because we know the famine took place during the Great Depression in the West. So you couldn't get much money from selling that grain on the international market. You can definitely sell it at low price, which was done by the Soviet Union, and it undermines capitalist economy because such grain producers, including the USA or Canada, they couldn't get much for their grain. And of course, the economists at the time were depressed, and people were also going through hardships. So you can obviously sabotage capitalist economy and international trade, but ultimately you wouldn't get much to finance your industrialization for selling grain at low prices. And what happened at the time, the industrialization, and that's against what we commonly understand, Ukrainian grain was used for industrialization. No, yes, it was, but in part. Recent studies by Russian, economic historians show that industrialization in the first half of 1933, and that's the research by Elena Sokina, so industrialization in the first half of 1933 for the whole Soviet Union was financed by the export of gold primarily. And if you think about where did that gold come from, because you didn't have gold mines in the 1930s at the time on such an industrial level in the USSR. So that gold was procured by Torksin, which is a state-owned chain of shops that was supposedly, initially to trade with foreign citizens. But during the famine and during collectivization, it was pretty much buying gold from starving population at very low, abysmally low prices in exchange for food. So you could go to that shop, which was trading with foreigners in the middle of Ukraine, far away from large cities. There would be a small branch of that chain, trading with peasants, and they would be taking their earrings, rings, and what I call family heirlooms that were passed on from generation to generation, including crosses, some medals, awards, Cossack crosses. So what is now considered a cultural heritage, in fact. And there were some artifacts of historical value. There were some parts of Orthodox icons, church gold and silver, and many many relics that otherwise would be precious today, and they would be obviously protected. By the time they were all melted down. And I will say just a few sentences here that it's apart from being obviously it was assault on individuals, but also it was assault on cultural heritage. And when we're talking about individuals, when you lose everything that keeps your family memory alive, when you lose everything material that connects you to your to your ancestors, and there is nothing in your household that reminds you of the past, a pre-collectivization, pre-Holodomor past, you turn into a Soviet collective famine, and there is very little in material culture between you, very little difference between you and somebody in Russia proper or somebody in Central Asia, because everything in material culture would be produced in the USSR. Your clothes, your furniture, your individual personal items, there would be nothing to differentiate you from Soviet collective farmer. You become, in effect, a Soviet collective farmer. And the majority of the rural population in Ukraine, unfortunately, experienced that.
Mentioned several times about the famine around the USSR in general. And I feel like it's one of the most common debate around the Holodomor. And can you tell that what many people can claim that the famine affected the entire USSR and that there was no intent to specifically target Ukrainians? Can you explain how and why Soviet regime actually did target Ukrainians, adding to what you mentioned previously already?
Thank you for that question. And I think the current war, the current Russo-Ukrainian war, is very illustrative in that dimension, especially when Russian opposition tries to present the current war as a common shared experience, that we are all Putin's victims or the regime's victims and so on. Yet Ukrainians are targeted foremost. And no, our experience is not the same. Yes, people are suffering, but Ukrainians are targeted because they are Ukrainians, and we have a population of Ukraine because they are in Ukraine. We are targeted for that. And returning back to the famine, yes, so there is collectivization taking place. It devastates the agriculture. Everybody suffers. And we can see a similarity in that everybody suffers because of collectivization. But what happens from 1932, summer 1932, we have these unrealistic grain procurement quotas, targets set for Ukraine. Ukrainian Republican leadership, including some district level officials at the party conference in Kharkiv in July 1932, voiced their concerns about such grain procurements for Ukraine would only exacerbate the existing famine. And they are telling of the suffering, they are telling of the facts. Yet Stalin's envoys, Kaganovich, Molotov, don't want to listen to anything. And we have really good stenograms of these conferences which show this resistance. Yet they insist, Stalin does insist, because there are telegrams flying back and forth between them. They pass these targets. And August 1932, many Ukrainian officials, about 30% on the local level, refused to go ahead with these grain procurement quotas for the rest of 1932, when this procurement campaign in autumn takes place after the harvest. And they voice their opinion, they put their party tickets down, and they want nothing to do with that, what was to follow. Some officials sabotage grain procurements, and they are put on show trials, some of them, but nobody's executed, and they just passed from one position to another. But show trials do, of course, have their effect. And I already mentioned that there is a concurrent persecution of the clergy, political elite, intellectuals, Ukrainian intellectuals, everyone who was instrumental in the Ukrainian struggle for independence or opposition to the Bolsheviks 10 years prior, following October Revolution. And we see intellectuals who question the role, this colonial relationship between Ukraine and Russia, also put on trial. We have this show trial 1930 for the liberation of the Union for the Liberation of Ukraine taking place in Kharkiv. And we have tens of thousands of intellectuals, teachers, political leaders later put on trial under the same premise in the 1930s. So we see this systematic persecution of anything that made Ukraine, not Soviet Ukraine. And as well as simultaneous abandonment or closure of the policy of Ukrainization or indigenization, Korenization in Ukraine, which promoted Ukrainian culture and education in Ukrainian and the use of Ukrainian and all other projects associated with stimulating Ukrainian culture and its development. So nothing of the sort happened in other parts of the USSR, with perhaps the exception of Kazakhstan, where events took somewhat different turn, and they did turn. There was a famine starting earlier than in the USSR. In Ukraine in 1931. We have already again a famine within a famine, or Soviet famine, which targeted the traditional ways, lifestyle of Kazakhs, their migrations. It was associated also with sedentarization because they were still nomads and they were crossing on their migration route throughout the year into China and back into Kazakhstan. So some practices that Soviet regime would not have tolerated. And they also were given grain procurement targets that were absolutely unsustainable. They didn't even produce grain, so they had to give up their cattle, their lifeline, and their intelligentsia was targeted. But sadly, apart from a number of Western scholars and political situation in Kazakhstan, such interpretations of genocidal nature of the famine in Kazakhstan are currently facing many challenges, let's put it this way. So we have not as much interest in the famine compared to the Holodomor, which is better researched, better reflected upon, and we see many new avenues in the study of the Holodomor. But also I have to say that, and that would be fair for all the Soviet famines, that in modern history, at least in the 20th century, and here I agree with the scholar Alex Debal, all famines are man-made in a way that even if you don't intend the consequences of your policy to be a famine, you can always prevent it, preempt it, or mitigate it. And nothing of the sort was done in the Soviet Union. So hence we can fully claim that all the famines, including the one that followed collectivization in the Soviet Union, they were man-made.
And I wanted to jump to ideas of Raphael Lemkin, which I think at the beginning of this podcast you mentioned as your view as well, this broader context of the genocide of Ukrainian people. And for someone who don't know, Raphael Lemkin was a Polish-Jewish lawyer who studied and lived in Ukraine for some time, and he was the one who coined the term genocide and created the basis of the UN Genocide Convention. And he actually said that the Holodomor, which was then called the Great Famine, was a classic example of genocide because Soviet policies targeted Ukrainians with the intent to destroy the somehow national idea. Maybe you can tell these kind of 4 points to elaborate on it, what he believed to be reasoning for the fact that it was a genocide, not just bad policies or like terrible policies of Stalin.
Yes, it is an important, even though I normally leave the issue of genocide to legal scholars, I cannot avoid this interpretation in my work because for me, the Holodomor was exactly that. It was a genocide. And it explains many of its complexities, why you would target intellectuals at the same time, why it was important to even in part to destroy a group and to change. And if we think about of Ukrainians being targeted as a political nation, indeed, because it was not Soviet. There was no, 10 years prior, there was no significant support for Bolsheviks, with the exceptions of some party cells in major industrial centers or Kharkiv or Kyiv. Majority of Ukrainians voted for other parties in the elections for the Constituent Assembly, which is the former Russian Empire or Russian Empire envisaged a proto-government. So Ukrainians didn't support Bolsheviks, and they resisted, especially in 2000. In 1919, we have a great peasant uprising against the Bolsheviks. And in Bolshevik, and in particular Stalin's understanding of nation, which was primordial, but also there were some elements of how political nations can form, peasantry was associated with this ground support, on the ground grassroots support of Ukrainian nationalism, which was understood very much in cultural and primordial terms, that you have to somehow subdue that base, because otherwise it will just keep nurturing these national movement, national aspirations in Ukraine. But Ukrainians, and we could see that under Petlura government, Ukrainians were not just ethnic nationalists in the time even. We see similar processes taking part in shtetls or small towns where Jewish population was in the majority. And we have very bad developments there in terms of the study of Hebrew, religious activity, and they were targeted during the famine as well. So we can see everything that was not Soviet, everything that could give spring to Ukraine as non-Soviet republic was eliminated. So those scholars of Hebrew were targeted as Zionists. They were prevented, their families that were not Soviet in effect. They were not collective farmers that were loyal to the regime. And those who tried to escape the famine by going to Birobidzhan in 1933 were not allowed to leave. And they were just trying to be stowaways on the trains, trying to leave the train stations to go to Birobidzhan, and they were prevented from doing so. And people were dying as a result. And we see nothing of the sort anywhere else. And when we are going back to Lemkin and his understanding of the genocide, that was informed by the events in Ukraine. And in his writing, he mentions that the famine in Ukraine that followed collectivization fits that description, fits his understanding of what the famine is. I am here following the interpretation of Roman Serbin, other scholars of the Holodomor, Roman Serbin and Victoria Malko. I might disagree with them on other issues regarding the Holodomor, but in this, and Miroslava Antonovich, who is a legal scholar, who showed that the Holodomor had 4 prongs, according to Lemkin, and they followed that interpretation too very closely and developed it very beautifully in a way, saying that we can see an intent by circumstantial evidence, because Stalin didn't write these documents. Yes, I want to target Ukrainians, but he said it in different ways. So there were 4 prongs of such an attack, that genocide, that was targeting Ukrainians in Ukraine, as well as we know, according to the latest research by Naumenko, another Russian scholar, that Ukrainians were targeted also in Russian Federation. So they had higher mortality rates from the starvation as compared to their Russian neighbors in neighboring districts. And that's years and years of research of these scholars to show that they were targeted disproportionately in Russian Federation too. So we have the famine, one of these prongs. Then you have to eliminate the church, Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian political elite. And it is targeting Ukrainian nation. And that's how I understand it. even though I would suggest consulting their works because they dedicated to that topic. So it's Victoria Malko, Roman Serbin, Miroslava Antonovich, who look into that in greater detail. I'm a social historian and I also look into cultural history, but I do agree. And everything you said is spot on that topic too.
Yeah, thank you. It's just with Lemkin, just to add to it, because I think he beautifully explained these 4 points through saying, for example, that attacking the church was attacking the soul of Ukraine, attacking intelligentsia was attacking the mind of Ukraine, attacking, starving the population, the peasantry, was actually to destroy the national idea, because the peasantry was the main sources of culture, of language. And also because, and the fourth point was that by killing big parts of Ukrainian political nation, and different ethnicities within Ukraine, there were kind of other people were settled in their place, which were, we can assume many of them were Russians. And why I believe it's fascinating to look into this idea is because this is what Russians are doing right now as well. With Crimea, with Mariupol, they're replacing the population to change the whole kind of societal idea of it.
Yes, and there is a temptation to say it was done immediately after the Holodomor. But what we can see immediately after the Holodomor, and there was some controversy about interpretation of that in the past by different scholars, but it was addressed. And as archival documents show us, immediately after the Holodomor in late 1933, we have a number of villages devastated, especially in Dnipro Oblast, Dnipropetrovsk Oblast at the time. We have villages wiped out by the famine, and you need to populate them for people to work there. So we see not only Russians and Belarusians brought to this village, but approximately the same number of Ukrainians from other parts of Ukraine were encouraged to go and settle there. In steppe, for example, people from Chernihiv or Oblast or Zhytomyr Oblast were not encouraged, but they were just ordered to go and live there. Some of them returned home, citing that they didn't have all the means to settle, and the local authorities didn't support them. For Russians who went there, and we have over 100,000 people being resettled to the south, they were unprepared to live in that climate, those conditions, and majority of them returned. So only 20,000 stayed behind. But that is not to say that is Russian. The Kremlin didn't put many Russians there later. What we see following World War II as a mass migration from Russian Federation into Ukraine was between following World War II and 1970s. We have about 10 million people resettling from other parts of the USSR in Ukraine. So not immediately after the Holodomor, but we see that it was creating Soviet people, and there were a number of policies involved in them, as well as people migration put in one parts of population and mixing people and making sure that they didn't have this attachment. And this is what exactly was with the heirlooms. And there is a beautiful research done by Irena Skubi in Material Culture of the Holodomor. She doesn't look into heirlooms per se, but she looks how our practices, how our consumption was changed by the Holodomor. And when I said that many of these heirlooms, including rings, jewelry, coins, medals, crosses, were melted and disappeared, and you become Soviet, also that happens with your clothes. And this is very interesting question, because since the years of since 1991 and even earlier than that, we have a great interest in Ukraine in embroidered shirts, vyshyvankas. People are collecting them, and reproducing old models with new, and there is definitely a fashion. I'm not obviously a historian of Vishwanka, but as a historian of the Holodomor, what I noticed that during the famine, many people took their embroidered towels or rushniki, or embroidered items of clothing to the markets, to the cities in exchange for food. And shirts were the first prime such examples, including the shawls and different scarves. They went to the cities, and those people who could give them food in return for these shirts were, of course, those people who had either rations, or they were relatives of the perpetrators, or their neighbors who could exchange, meaning that they had some means to exchange these shirts. So the shirts that survived till today from before 1933, that were made before 1933, have definitely changed hands, unless they were preserved somewhere and the family just managed to get by without exchanging them. So they were changing hands, and obviously between the groups of perpetrators and the victims, or those who had some access to food and those who did not. But it's interesting to trace the history of that, or this particular shirt, and who it originated from, and how it was. Did it save life? Did it amount to loaf of bread? Because in some of the villages I went to interview people, there would be sometimes stories of the whole house exchanged for a loaf of bread. Or indeed, people were telling me some details about their material culture completely overturned by the Holodomor. For example, somebody born in 1935 telling me about the famine in 1946-47, and her father going to Western Ukraine, taking embroidered again shirts that were produced after the famine already to Western Ukraine, and whatever valuables they had to exchange, and bringing back lentils or sochevitsia. And the child who grew up after collectivization, she didn't know what sochevitsia was, or lentils, because this is something their collective farm never sown, never harvested, and nobody did that on vegetable plots. And she was asking her parents, how can we eat this? What is this in the first place? And her mother explaining her, oh, don't worry, we had it before collectivization. And that shows how the everyday life was changed completely. And there are some other collection of testimonies of the survivors and some perpetrators by William Knoll, published first in Ukrainian, actually, by Rodovit in 1999, when people discuss their material culture as well as culture, not material culture, changed completely by the famine, because it removes everything surplus, not superfluous, but something that you can exchange in order to survive. And especially when you are reduced to this basic instant survival, you give up everything. And that obviously contributes to your trauma caused by the famine.
And in this broader sense, how it actually changed the logic of Ukrainian societies in many ways, Soviet policies and the Holodomor did it on a big scale. For example, what we know that in the 80s, which was already believed to be this kind of democratization of the USSR, but at the same time, the Soviet policies targeted Ukrainian vineyards and gardens, and how basically Ukrainians farm and procure food somehow. Is there any specific stories on how the Holodomor affected this logic of how Ukrainian villagers lived and worked before the Holodomor and after?
Oh, yes. I would refer to a very specific and very visual example of that. The film Zemlya by Alexander Dovzhenko, in which he shows the tragedy of plowing through the centuries-long boundaries between the plots, the peasant plots, because only 25% of Ukrainians practiced this община, or mir. Majority Yeah, exactly. Communes. Ukrainian peasants didn't have the same traditions in agriculture as Russian peasants. They had a lot to lose. If you acquired land, and land was sacred, and this is what Dovzhenko shows inadvertently in supposedly a propaganda film, which could be read both ways, as Demyan Bedny did and criticized Dovzhenko's film for. Because he shows the tragedy of Ukrainian peasants losing land, whereas in majority of Russian agricultural communities, you had this черный передел, or you had distribution of land based on the number of eaters or individuals in your family. So you didn't have the same attachment to land as Ukrainian peasants did, who preserved land. And of course, within one generation, you could become poor, or you can become rich based on luck, on your work, and many, many other factors. But nevertheless, there was this attachment to land, meaning that I will pass it on to my children. I'm settled here. I'm working on this. Yes, there is very little land, but nevertheless, this is something sacred. Whereas in Russia, when 12 years you work on one plot of land and then you're given another, you are not you're motivated to invest in it, and you don't form the same attachment. So when it was taken away, and how it showed in Dovzhenko's film, it just a cognitive dissonance for many. It's just unthinkable, and it just destroys the Ukrainian society as it was. So yes, all these policies, Soviet policies, are very they espouse the perspective of the central government that doesn't care for the individual or human rights or private property, which I'm not trying to idealize Ukrainian society, but arguably it was far stronger here than it was in Russia proper, where collectivization, though it was a tragedy, it didn't have the same effect on the society as it did in Ukraine by completely changing the whole way of thinking of oneself and its property, their property, and how can your private property rights could be violated. So Soviet policies definitely changed the way of attachment and just acceptance that your private property rights could be violated, I suppose.
How did the USSR
Oh, that's a very interesting question, because obviously it was silenced until late 1987, even within the Republic. Having said that, there were Soviet Ukrainian writers who were writing, as well as Russian Soviet writers who touched upon the subject of the famine of 1932-33 in Ukraine, saying, for example, there were Platonov and other Russian writers saying there were Ukrainian peasants coming from Ukraine, crossing into Russian Federation. They were starving, dying on the streets, and they were obviously witnesses of something horrible that happened in Ukraine. Officials in Russia were complaining, saying, do something. We cannot feed everyone. We cannot help. Something is happening. So they were unaware that it was pretty much state policy, the local ones. It was silenced within the country, even though some writers were using Aesopian language or euphemisms to describe. Right from the beginning of 1933, we have Lyubchenko, Kirilenko, many Soviet proletarian writers describing in great detail about even sexual violence during the famine. So they had all the details. They themselves were in the procurement brigades. So we have that within the Republic, but you can't openly say, oh, my mother died, or I watched my siblings die. And you could be penalized for that, for anti-Soviet agitation. And there is this well-published now and discussed diary by Ukrainian teacher Radchenko, for which she was, it was discovered because they were searching her house for something else, but they found this diaries from the 1932-33 in which she describes all the these horrors of the famine, and she was sent to Gulag for, I think, 10 years or so. So, yeah, you could be prosecuted for that. But what about outside? Of course, the peasants are crossing into neighboring countries, and there are emigres, and following World War II, more emigres who describe all the horrors. They live on their personal accounts, they are publishing articles, memoirs, and for example, there were visitors from America, Mendel Osherovich, who came to Mestechko and left a really good memoir that recently has been published. And there are defectors like Kravchenko or Hoychenko who also published their accounts. So did the world know? Yes. The governments, including even Spain, and we have, again, research, just recent research showing how well-informed governments of other countries were, why they didn't do anything. For example, 10 years prior, we have the famine in Volga region, Golod Povolzhya, and Lenin appealing to the leaders or all honest people through, obviously, Gorky, to provide an international famine relief. And it is provided by the enemies, capitalist enemies, who invaded, obviously, in 1919, Antanta. So they are providing help. And yeah, Soviet authorities are willing to accept it. And that's going back again to the notion of modern famine being a man-made famine. When something like that happens and the government doesn't seek to hide it, you can always mitigate it by asking international community for help. You can distribute resources within the country, or you can sell some assets like they did in following the revolution to feed the starving in Povolzhya. They sold works of art, Tretyakovska, Hermitage. They were all these world-renowned and famous galleries were selling works of art to feed the starving. Church gold. You can sell something to feed the starving. Nothing of the sort was done. In fact, it was silenced and it was denied, and we have these fellow travelers or useful idiots or somebody on the payroll spreading propaganda, which is very similar to the events today and how propaganda works. And what this, even in America, we have these right-wing commentators, conspiracy bloggers, and all of them undermining the notion of independent Ukraine and showing that centuries-old narratives are resurfacing again. So we have similar situation back in the day, and Soviet Russia was financing those, their lifestyles, those fellow travelers, including Walter Duranty. And so how can you silence that? Especially if a country wants to help the starving, and we have grassroots efforts by the Ukrainian immigrant societies and different organizations, and friends of Ukraine like Malcolm Margrich and Ria Kleiman and Gareth Jones, drawing attention to what was happening in Ukraine. Here, I would say some national interests of particular countries come to the fore, and we see the United States establishing diplomatic relations with the USA late in 1933, and we see geopolitics and the global context affecting such decisions. And of course, Hitler coming to power, and for example, Churchill said that he would even collaborate with devil if he had to defeat Hitler. He would say a good word for the devil in the House of Lords if he had to make this coalition against Hitler. So you see these processes taking place when you have to choose sides, and the Soviet Union seems to be the lesser evil. And for national interests, for trade, and so on, you somehow make these compromises. And Ukrainians and Ukraine, that at the time was part of the USSR, is overlooked. And we see similar narratives taken place now, that with Putin's nuclear blackmail, we have to make compromises and overlook Ukraine. And these are very dangerous narratives, and they are definitely supported by these pundits that I wouldn't say immediately claim that they're sponsored by Russia, but certainly it plays into the hand of the aggressor.
But it is interesting, this personal level as well, because all of this geopolitics and everything around, I think is kind of quite understood, and we are going through it over and over again. But for example, at that time, many international journalists visited the USSR. And they reported there was no major problem. I think it was a famous article by Walter Duranty that Russia is struggling but not dying from hunger, something like this. And Walter Duranty was at that point editor and journalist of the New York Times. And also, for example, Bernard Shaw also visited. And they both downplayed the tragedy and basically shared these lives with the world. And can you maybe tell if there is any historical documents that explain why this choice was made? Maybe besides some personal level that we will never understand, but if there is some kind of connections with them to the Soviet Union or to Stalin directly, why specifically this narrative was chosen by them, and did they actually see the realities, or they were kept in the bubble of Moscow somehow?
Well, that's the question for the whole dissertation or a book. And there are such books being written at the time, right now, about the role of these fellow travelers. We can go case by case, but if we are to make a generalization, I would say that, of course, there were true believers who were willing to overlook the famines and other excesses of such great transformations as they were positioning them, collateral cost, which would be the 4 million in Ukraine alone dead from the Holodomor. And Beatrice and Sidney Webb, who still are actually remembered in Great Britain as great thinkers of the 1930s, they espoused socialist views, and they did know the situation on the ground, and they were willing to overlook it. In part, there is this Orientalist approach as well, because it happens something to other people, and these people are barbaric or savages, and they are not like us. They're peasants. They just came out from feudalism, and this is their culture, and this is their traditional way of living, suffering from the famine. And so that logic was espoused, I suppose, or used to explain why it's acceptable for somebody in the Soviet Union to starve for the greater good, but not the same criteria would be applied to the starving in, I would say, Greater Anglia. But same logic would be applied to the starving in Ireland, 60 years prior, or almost 100 years prior, during the potato famine. There was very little sympathy for those starving and dying in Ireland at the time, and a larger proportion of Irish died during that famine, even compared to Ukrainian, which is around 12.5 or 12.7%. So proportionally more Irish died. And so we see that imperial or Orientalist logic, because Ukrainians are removed from them in space. And also when you take great ideas, greater visions as having a greater, epistemologic value for just authority. This is how it should be done. And Walter Duranty himself, as I said, from case to case, he came from a humble background in Britain, and then he made his career in the West, in America. But in the Soviet Union, he was very well looked after, and he lived a very lavish lifestyle. He had a lavish lifestyle in Moscow, tended to all his hedonist demands, and he had orgies. He participated in them, and it's well documented now that we have archives open and some other people's recollections of him. We can see him as a hedonist and who cared little about ethics, and he left his maid or his partner, who was Russian, in Moscow, and a child, and didn't care for them. So he enjoyed things as they came and moved on, and he thought very little about ethics. And so Ukrainians, I suppose, in that respect, came at the very bottom of his priorities, to accept the truth about what was happening on the ground. There were other different journalists who later reflected upon their experiences and showed remorse and regret. But many, I suppose, like Bernard Shaw, who was already pretty old at the time, I don't think he cared. And a former Prime Minister of France came, Edouard Herriot, and he had a very well orchestrated visit, like Potemkinsky villages in Ukraine at the time. He knew what was happening. It was impossible because there were always hiccups in such staged visits. They saw what they wanted to see, and they stayed true to the line that the Kremlin wanted them to convey. When you had journalists who, disobeyed or provided an alternative view, such as Gareth Jones or Ria Kleiman, they were just expelled from the country altogether. And there was a concentrated effort to silence them, to ridicule them, to downplay their message. So I suppose it's very similar to what is happening today too.
Well, Gareth Jones, who was a Welsh journalist, and he probably the most famous person now, and kind of a hero among Ukrainians, because he was trying to tell the truth, and he was killed by the KGB, as far as we know, for this. Walter Duranty, for example, he still has the Pulitzer Prize for his report from the Soviet Union. So basically a man who went there just to enjoy his life and was in close connections to Stalin and to the Kremlin in general, Pulitzer Prize still refused to take away this mention, now. And that's why it's just one of the little reasons why this conversation like ours are now happening, because we need to explain again and again. So I wanted to jump to the way actually Holodomor is studied and the way it explained. When I was thinking about it, I thought about Christopher Hitchens, who once said that he learned more about the Holocaust by reading Holocaust deniers. And I think we can generally agree that it's important to debate. And even if this conversation involve the most unpopular opinions, it can encourage to examine the subject even closer. But there is this thing that the war against Ukrainians is not history, it's happening right now. How do you think, should there be an academic debate on this subject at this moment, basically claiming that, okay, it was not a genocide, everyone suffered, or it should not? How do you see it from maybe academic perspective as well?
Well, that's a question I've been thinking about, and you're right. When we have the Holodomor deniers, it presents immediately an opportunity to explore why they're saying that and what it points to. For example, if you say everyone was starving, as a Russian historian, and you immediately think, well, what are the differences? It points to a new area of research in the Holodomor. How the Holodomor was different from other famines in the USSR at the time. And you learn from that? Yes, indeed, you do. And you compare, and our demographers wanted to compare the excessive mortality in Volga region to the one in Ukraine. And they were trying to access data, and later, now it's obviously impossible. But indeed, they point to the areas you can study to not destroy, but deconstruct their argument that it was the same. Or you could look at the positionality of these deniers as well. There is one Ukrainian historian who actively undermined or even ridiculed the cultural memory and historical memory of the Holodomor, saying that it was something that was brought to Ukraine by Ukrainian diaspora. But when you look at his positionality, we can see that the person is still maintaining these narratives, colonial narratives of relations between Ukraine as something not worth of attention. It's just part of greater Russian nation, and it should be overlooked. And all these attempts to theorize about the Holodomor are pointless. And then you look at personal background of that historian, and you realize that actually his grandparents were taking part in collectivization, or they were Sovietizing Western Ukraine. And of course, positionality of that person becomes understandable, that they are still maintaining these imperial narratives. Likewise, for more generally, it points us to the colonial, that we should decolonize studies about the USSR and the Holodomor. We should look at how people perpetrators who followed the orders sometimes from the cities where they were sent to the countryside, what rationale they provided for their actions. Were they doing that for the greater good, or were they doing that because they didn't consider Ukrainians something worthy? And for example, Lev Koplev in his memoirs provides a very detailed account of what disregard he held for Ukrainian peasants during the new economic policy, about their culture, about independent Ukraine, and how, for example, he rated Germans culturally considerably higher than Ukrainians. And then you understand his positionality and how he became agent of Russian or Soviet Empire rather than narrow understanding of him as a Ukrainian Jew or ethnic nationalism. So we talk about already political identities, and we see that during the famine, during the Holodomor, and we see them now when some people consider themselves still Soviet, or they consider themselves belonging to Russian world, and that's, I mean, it's not based on your ethnic background, but your political affiliation. And we're going back to Benedict Anderson and Imagine Community, which community you belong to and how you explain the Holodomor. But as researchers, as historians, as philosophers, we can take a step back and look at why the famine happened and how it happened on the ground. And we can definitely see that colonial relations between the Kremlin and Soviet Ukraine. And then we also, that would be the question of how to decolonize that. We also face challenges, not only some Ukrainian historians, but also we face challenges in Western academia as well, because up until the demise of the Soviet Union and 1980s, up until pretty much the publication of Robert Conquest's book, Slavonic studies scholars overlooked Ukraine. They didn't have it on their mental map, and even when they did, it was in relations to Nazi occupation of Ukraine and collaboration narratives of Ukrainian national movement being smeared about also collaboration. So it wasn't until recently, and the war obviously highlighted this question, when we have to look at Ukraine within a longue durée history, this context of 200 years, and to see the Holodomor as one of the steps, one of the attempts to subdue Ukraine, right from Baturin or even before then to Bucha, we see a string of events, both militarily response to Ukraine as well as cultural, economic. We see these attempts to create a colony out of Ukraine, just like Ireland was to England or Scotland to England. It was made British, and Irish managed to break that yoke 100 years ago. But the response was pretty much similar. Who are you, Irish? You should be proud of being British, and he only achieved good things, and he developed just because of being part of British Empire. And you shouldn't think of yourselves as independent, and we will teach you a lesson. And there was a war, obviously, and then there was a civil war between different parts of Irish society, whether to accept the compromise of Northern Ireland or not. And so we see, if I was to compare this colonial relation and how to colonize, it would be the example of England and Ireland. But obviously, every case is unique.
But if still we see a lot of these Russia-centric views of the region in general, and as you mentioned with Slavonic studies and things like this, that basically Russian studies, what can we do to decolonize studies about the Holodomor? What needs to change for it to start being Ukraine-centric?
Oh, that's a very important question, and I think it's all done through education. We have to talk about Ukraine in the West. We have to talk about Ukraine in Western academia, because the more people know about Ukraine, the more likely they would see Ukraine. They would locate Ukraine in their mental map, and they would be interested in Ukraine, because when you don't know much about the country, you can't even make an informed decision about the country. And what was happening in Cambridge, for example, when we had our students going to Russia for their year abroad as part of their degree, they would come back Russians through and through, very sympathetic to Russian position, very sympathetic to Russian cause, and overlooking republics as Kyrgyzstan or Georgia or Ukraine as something secondary to their interests, of course. But following annexation of Crimea, many of them chose to go because of the situation in Russia and some repressions actually against Western scholars. A colleague of mine spent months, I think 2 months, or at least months, in a Russian prison for research in Russian revolution in provincial Russia, in the archives. She was accused of plotting to overthrow the government. Anyway, so when they went to non-Russian republics, non-Russian states, they came back critical of Russia because they knew the experience of these countries and the oppression of their cultures, of their strive for independence and national movement. So students coming back from Kyrgyzstan, not only did they speak the language, but they also were critical, and they had this distance in view in Russia. Whereas older generation of British scholars who went for exchange to Russia and lived for long periods of time in Russia, Soviet Russia, during just before 1991, they were looked after. They also, amid the Cold War, they had a different experience of the Soviet Union, and so they were coming not as drab or oppressive, obviously. They were coming back, and they were witnessing this Cold War anti-Soviet propaganda, and they thought they knew Russia better, and they had personal contacts. They formed, some of them married Russian women, but many of them developed this personal connection to Russia. And when you spend your whole life studying Russia, and you see Soviet Union as an alternative to the shortcomings of the West, to the conservative policies, to the Tories, to anti-Soviet propaganda, you develop natural affinity towards Soviet Union and Russia. And then you are less likely to view it critically, even despite the war in Ukraine, despite, again, now they compare that to Cold War propaganda, anti-Russian war propaganda, and they spend their whole life studying Russian. To study Ukraine or Kyrgyzstan right now, or Kazakhstan or Tajikistan now, it's something that would be very difficult for them to do. And I suppose with many being critical of their own governments, Russia somewhat is not taken as critically as it should be. And obviously, knowing not as much about Ukraine doesn't help the cause. So the answer would be to decolonize, we need to study Ukraine and to talk about Ukraine and fight what Alessia Hromenchuk calls Ukrainian fatigue in the media. And I think there are a number, including your institution, very potent and robust and punchy cultural organizations in Ukraine and outside Ukraine. And Ukraine Holodomor Museum is one of them that contributed to this cause of making Ukraine better known, and Holodomor in particular, the Holodomor, that the world should know about the Holodomor.
No one was held accountable for these crimes and for the Soviet crimes in general. And as we see, Russia was even praised after, so this was more or less not discussed that much. What do you believe from the historical perspective and from your expertise, what can be a closure for Ukrainians with the Holodomor?
I would be very brief. Russia should be held accountable. And I hope after the victory in war, Russia will be held accountable not for the current war crimes and the genocide against Ukrainians, but also for the Holodomor, and it would be recognized internationally. And I think it would be a very symbolic value, because obviously all the top perpetrators are gone now, and you can't prosecute local perpetrators, and some of their descendants already intermarried with the descendants of the victims. But it would actually be symbolical in the terms of rule of law. And Ukraine, and I hope, obviously, Ukraine is not perfect, but it's moving in the right direction. And I hope for the rule of law to prevail. It will never be absolute, but in Ukraine, it would mean that you can't follow criminal orders, even if they are coming from the top, and you can't believe that you can get away with a crime if you are part of a local elite, if you're a judge or prosecutor or in the police and so on. And in the Holodomor, many of the officials believed that, and rightly so, that they would get away. And I hope that for Ukrainians, the closure would be more responsible and responsive state with checks and balances, free and fair elections, and of course, rule of law. I think this is what the Holodomor and the current war are highlighting Ukrainians need and deserve, and I hope for the best.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please support us at buymeacoffee.com/Ukrainian International and follow us on social media in different languages. You can find all the links in the podcast description. And thank you for listening.